Aloha. Welcome to Lease seminars sessions. We're going to talk about today about when does the lease end? How do you terminate the lease? And what kind of leases do you have, and how will the lease terminate, either friendly or not so friendly? So we're going to talk about both types. The first one, which is the easiest and the simplest and the cleanest, is the lease has ended. And you're telling the landlord, you know what, I'm not going to extend my lease. So as soon as my lease is over, I'm done. And I happened to have that when I had a lease with my landlord near the Ala Moana Shopping Center. So I had a school classroom. It was 1,800 square feet. My rent was about $8,000 a month. COVID hit, and we couldn't have any live classes. And fortunately, my lease was ending at about the time COVID took over. So I told the leasing manager, hey, look, we're going to go live webinar, and we're going to have independent study and use the internet as our medium to teach the class. So when the lease is over, I'm done. Do not extend my lease. So it expired. We cleaned up the room, shampooed the carpet, and we were done. And we gave up the property. The landlord was happy, and we're fine. So that's the best way to get out when the lease expires. The second one is when you surrender the space. And if the landlord and the tenant mutually agree to terminate the lease, and you give up the space as a tenant, and the landlord takes it back, you're done. Well, the landlord's not going to just let you get out. But what if somebody else wants your space because you have a choice corner unit, or you have a beautiful view, and you have the right size that someone wants? So that new tenant to be tells the manager, hey, we're going to pay you a higher cost per square foot if we can get into the place. So the manager, leasing agent, will come to you or to me and say, hey, Abe, somebody wants your space. Are you going to give it up? And if I say, well, business isn't doing so well, and yeah, I might be willing to give it up as long as you give me a release of liability. So now I've surrendered the space, someone else has taken over, and my lease is over. And I'm forgiven of the lease conditions. That's a surrender. Okay? Now, if I want to get out, and the landlord says no, and they don't have someone else that wants to pay more or wants to take your space, then I'm stuck. And they will come after me if I don't pay my lease rent. Now, the third one is what we call breach of condition. When either the landlord or the tenant fail to perform according to the conditions of the lease, that's a breach. But if the tenant breaches, then I think the tenant's still liable for the rent. If the landlord breaches, then the tenant should be able to get out. Okay? So you can get out depending on who's at fault. If the landlord is at fault, then the tenant get out. But if the tenant is at fault, then the landlord will not let that tenant out. They will try to collect the rent. There's the next one called eviction. There's two types of evictions. The actual eviction happens when the tenant cannot pay and doesn't have the money, and the business is not going well. Or they violated the rules, or the house rules, or the law, and the landlord wants them evicted. If they don't pay and they have violated the rules, I believe the landlord can still come after them for the back rents or the future rents because they're in default. But if the landlord was in default, then of course the tenant get out. All right? So in actual eviction, if the tenant is at fault, I believe the landlord can still come after you. I'm not an attorney, but that's my just logical thinking. Who's at fault and who's responsible? The next one is called constructive eviction. And this happened to one of my friends. They're renting a house on the windward side. They moved in, and a day or two after, the house caught on fire. Everything they had in the house burnt. That is constructive eviction because now the premises are not habitable and it's not safe. At that point, the landlord has to give the full security deposit back, and the tenant can leave and not pay any more on the lease rent because they can't live there. So that's called constructive eviction, when the place becomes uninhabitable and it's unsafe. We don't see that happen too often, but it could. So let's say the wind comes through and blows the roof off and wets everything. That's constructive eviction. All right. So at that point, the tenant has to leave. Then they can stop the payments on the rent and get their security deposit back. The next one is called prior right. So what does that mean? Well, if there's a foreclosure on a property that the landlord owns and he's renting the house to you, and they had the mortgage first, and then the lease was put into place, the mortgage document says that if the owner or the borrower is in default, then we have the right to foreclose. And the lease rent should say that if there's a mortgage in place, then the bank has first rights to kick the tenant out and to terminate the lease. But let's say the rent went in first, the lease went in first, and then the landlord got the loan. Well, in that case, the tenant's lease would supersede the bank's right to foreclose. So when they say who has prior right, which came first, the mortgage or the lease? If the mortgage came first, then the lease is second. If the lease came first, then the mortgage is second. So it depends on the timing. And then what if there's condemnation of the property? And they're going to condemn the land because they're going to put a freeway in the way, all right? Usually those take a long time. But if there's some condemnation that's imposed by the government, then the tenant has to move. Usually they don't have a choice. And then next is what they call destruction of the premises. So if the tenant's leasing a part of the building, like say it's a multi-unit building, and only their unit is destroyed, then the whole building doesn't get out. Only the parts that are uninhabitable with the constructive eviction. All right? But usually it relieves the tenant of the rents if there's destruction or damages like constructive eviction. And the last one is called abandonment. This happens once in a great while with, say, the commercial properties. Tenant moves in, signs a 10, 15, 20-year lease. Business doesn't go well, they're going to shut down the operation. So now they're going to take everything out and abandon basically the lease. The landlord can say, wait a minute, you got 5 more years on your lease. You owe the remaining time of lease. All right? In that case, if the business is still in business and still can make payments because they have other stores or businesses in different states or different areas, then the tenant has to pay. If the company goes bankrupt, then there's a pretty good chance probably that the bankrupt company can get out because they're shutting down the whole operation. But if you abandon the property and you're still capable of having income and paying the rent, but you don't because the business isn't going well, the landlord can come after you. So in a commercial lease, the attorneys will now step in and say, what kind of assets does this tenant have? Can we go after him even though the business has gone under? So if you have financial capacity to make the payments, even though you abandoned the premises or you moved out of state, you'll still be liable. Same with the tenant on a residential. If the tenant has lost his job and got sick and can't pay, the landlord still can come after the tenant for non-payment of the rents. Commercial properties, usually the larger landowners will hire an attorney, a law firm, and come after the lessee that is in default. And if you have assets, you have income from other sources, you're going to pay. So those are the different ways that you can terminate the lease. Hope this helps. Aloha.